Welcome to the channel. This is David Poe. Let me show you the colors we're working with today. We're using a yellow light. We're using Pyro Red, Alizarin Crimson, Ultramarine Blue, Burnt Umber, and Titanium White. We're also using water. I'm using water mixable oils today. These are the Cobra line of colors, but you can use traditional oils or acrylics. It does not really matter which type of oil paint you're using for this demo. Just showing you my brushes, an assortment of flats and one liner brush. Those are ones that are made by Princeton. They're the Aspen line. This is an 11 by 14 canvas panel. I'm using the Coulter easel. And I also picked up one of these stands from a Michaels store for my home studio, which is really convenient. I'm just showing you there my quick dry medium. I'm not going to be using that today though. I also use a squeegee from time to time, and you can see my assortment of paints in the craft cart there. This is the reference photo. This is a free resource which was available on the internet. And yes, we are going to be using that photo reference for our painting today. And the paper towels fit nicely on that stand. If you liked the video, of course, you haven't seen it yet, but hopefully if you like this video, please give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I also have other videos on this channel that you may find very helpful. All right, today we're going to start with an underpainting. This is going to be an underpainting to really make sure that we get the values correct in this scene. And we're using burnt umber, making sure I've got a piece of paper towel handy. And I'm just putting some of that burnt umber on my brush and then mixing it with a little bit of water. We want this to be a very thin layer. And as you may be able to tell from that reference photo, this is a rather dark painting. And so I am actually going to be covering the entire canvas with this first layer of burnt umber, just using tonal values. Sketching in now the shape of that lake that comes in from the side. And then there's a road that's also taking us into the painting. Organizationally, I'm looking at this and seeing what you might call an O composition. If you're familiar with the work of Hawthorne, he's got a famous book about landscape painting composition that you may want to check out from your local library or purchase a copy from a bookstore. And that means basically that I want you to come into the painting and to basically stay pretty much in the center of the painting. And we can do that with our values. We can do that with the amount of detail that we put in the center portions of the painting. And you'll see that when I put in some trees. And also there's a nice bank that leads down into the lake. And that's where we have the most color contrast. And so our eye is going to be naturally drawn to it. So right now I'm just sketching out the big shapes that I see. And notice I'm not trying to be very detailed here. Right now it doesn't really look like anything. And one of the things that you, as I've said in some of the other videos, you have to remind yourself to paint ugly at first and just stay with it. Don't try to paint one section perfect before moving on to the other. At least in my method, I never do that. I'm looking at the big shapes and approximating some of the tonal values to start with this burnt umber. And then we'll give it some time to dry as we're putting this layer on very thinly, mixing in quite a bit of water, but not to the point where it's running. We don't want the paint really running off the canvas. And now I start with the darkest dark. So I'm looking at this painting and noticing that the darkest dark is some of these tree shapes. Now, of course, I'm also remembering that I'm using a photo reference, which is never going to give me quite the same information as being on scene painting plein air. So it tends to darken the darks too much and blow out the colors too much. So that's where your experience of painting outdoors will come into play, and you'll be able to approximate some of the colors or to remember these particular scenes that you took the photos of and be able to come back into the studio in order to work on it or be able to do it outdoors. The main reason I do these videos in my studio is I work full time, so I don't always have the time to paint outdoors or to take advantage of all the sunlight. So you got to do what you got to do. And it does help because I can control the environment and the camera much better in a studio setting than I can outdoors. So here you see, I'm putting the darkest darks. I'm already putting in some places where I think some tree limbs and tree branches and trunks are going to go with those little brown lines that you see. But notice that I'm just looking at the big shapes of color and trying to approximate this, the tonal value rather. Now I'm adding some titanium white. Yeah, that's how you lighten the color. Titanium white, but not too much into this brown mixture because I've already put the darkest darks and now I want to step it down a little bit. And so I'm mixing into my palette. I do find that this particular palette works much like a French easel, but without all the weight for plein air painting. So I used a lot of different easels, and you've seen some others in the other videos that I have, but I've decided to finally, I hope, settle down on this particular model. And now after I have mixed some of that in, it does look a little bit more gray, but that's okay. Keep in mind that really I'm just focusing on the tonal value. I'm going to come back in with thicker paint and color in the next pass. But for now, all I want to do is concentrate on those big shapes and put down some of these tonal values, which are rather subtle shifts, before moving along. And oftentimes what happens then is that this method, some folks will underpaint the whole panel, right, with like an orange color or a reddish color, especially if there's a lot of greens, and then let that dry completely, and then go back in and sketch out the big shapes and so forth. This saves that step. It's just a white canvas, as you tell, but with getting our tonal values on there, we're also doing the underpainting. So you can essentially use any color that you want for this. If I wanted to, I could go in there with a burnt sienna or maybe a little bit more of an orange color with a combination of colors to make my orange. And then just vary the tonal values with that. And then I've got the underpainting, and I've also got the sketch telling me where exactly I'm putting some things in the second layer when I add additional color. And here, a lot of this underpainting is going to show through. And it'll give some variety and depth and originality, I hope, to the painting. Here I'm just noticing that this landscape with the green grass is coming towards me. There are places that are obviously darker than others. And so I'm using the brown value here to mark those areas. And notice that this is an ugly painting right now. If someone were to come and see the painting at this point, they might think, oh boy, this fella doesn't know how to paint. And that's one of the things you have to break yourself of is what others are going to think of your process. They're folks that mean well, but obviously if you've never had any training in painting, you would probably attack this painting thinking, okay, trees are green, the landscape is green primarily, so I'm going to mix some greens and I'm going to immediately put the greens down. And I'm going to maybe labor to make that exact starting at maybe the front section and move backwards, or the back and move forwards. But I'm going to really try to get the detail in one section before I get the detail in the other sections. But notice that most of the time, if you try that, your painting's going to lack a sense of freshness, looseness. So, and I enjoy painting in an impressionistic style, so I'm not worried about the detail. So I want to just get some gestures on the canvas. I want to notice I use the very tip of the paintbrush, so that way there's more flexibility of that brush head to do its job more effectively than me trying to control it as if I was holding it like a pencil or something. And I'm using the entire arm, elbow to lay down these strokes. I'm not getting real close to the canvas panel and trying to be very conscious of every single little mark that I'm sticking on the canvas, especially not right now. And even though this it looks very gray right now, but that's because of the titanium white mixing with the burnt umber. But it still gives me, if you squint, you can see the differences here. And that will provide a roadmap for me to come back in with color that will match these tonal values. I live here in Washington, Missouri, and my favorite subject is landscape, so you will not see me paint much else. I do like painting different types of landscapes. I like seascapes as well. Even though I don't live by a beach, I certainly have friends who send me pictures and I can get other reference work so that I can also do paintings of different types of landscape. But obviously, living in Missouri, I feel like I have some kind of an obligation to attempt to take scenes from Missouri and translate them into paint, just as other artists who live on the coast attempt to do, or in the center part of the United States, or wherever you may be located, England or South Africa, or wherever you may be. And you will see that there's some white of the canvas panel that's poking through, but that's going to be okay. This is a very thin layer of paint. It's not going to cover everything, nor do I want it to necessarily cover every piece of the white canvas at this point. In the subsequent layers, there are going to be other colors on top of these, and that will give us some variety as the paint colors mix a little bit with this underpainting, and some of the underpainting shows through. I hang a plastic bag over the tripod, as you can see it hanging there, and that's where I dispose of my paper towels. If you're making various changes in color in your paintings, be sure to always use enough paper towels. You don't want to use a dirty paper towel and end up making a mess or getting different colors on your canvas that you didn't want, or not effectively cleaning off your brush, even if you're rinsing it in your water, or mineral spirits if you're using traditional oils. My studio is small, and so one of the things I've done recently is transition to Cobra water mixable oils. There's no smell, there's no harmful chemicals. That's what water mixable oils were designed to do for college campuses. to cut down the cost and the possibility of fires and other accidents happening. Not that long ago, one of the paint manufacturers I used to use, Blue Ridge, wonderful paints, but they had a fire that destroyed at least part of their facility, if I remember right. So it does happen. And if you're using traditional oils, you need to make sure you have the proper ventilation and dispose of your towels in a kind of a metal can that's airtight, and dispose of them with your local authorities so that you don't have situations where rags can sometimes spontaneously combust if they have a lot of linseed oil on them or other mineral spirits, etc. These things can ignite. Now, if you squint now, you can sort of see the different tonal values, and they're rather close together. Like I said, it's a very dark painting, and that's because I'm interpreting this reference photo as being rather dark. Think about the early hours when the sun is just shining, it's just starting to come up. And if it's a cloudy day, that diminishes the light source. Here, there's some areas where you can see through the trees. And so I'm indicating that with this light shade, which is about the lightest that you see next to the sky. You'll also notice, as I shared with you at the very beginning of the video, I use a very limited palette. The primaries, titanium white. The one additional earth tone is the burnt umber that I'm using right now. So I use normally this is actually in the Cobra line. I think it's called primary yellow. I may have said yellow light, but that will work as well. But primary yellow is the actual color of the Cobra paint I'm using. And then for the red, it's Pyrrole red for some of the brightest reds. And then I also include on my palette the alizarin crimson. Pyrrole red, I don't always use that much, but I always put it out on my palette. Alizarin crimson is a little too dark to reach certain values with red, I found, so that's why I include 2 reds on the palette. And then for my blue, I use ultramarine blue. I also keep in mind the cost. Ultramarine blue is relatively a cheap color. So is burnt umber and titanium white. Pyrrole red is kind of in the middle in terms of the cost range. The most expensive is usually your cadmiums. So the primary yellow is also not as expensive as the cadmium colors. And in the Cobra line, there's a couple of other yellow choices, but there's a permanent yellow, and I will sometimes use that instead of the primary yellow. Now, because so many people do not use the water mixables, at least that's my hunch, they tend to be less expensive than traditional oils. One thing I will remind you about, it takes a little bit of time to adjust to using water mixable oils, I found. If you are coming from or you have some experience with watercolor, then there are times in which you can actually replicate some of the things that you might do with watercolor with the water mixable oils. I also find that using water mixable oils, you have to use larger amounts of paint. especially if you're going to be using some water to thin it down with. So here, obviously in the sky, it's a rather dark day. So I'm going to be coming back over top of this with some blues, but I think that this will provide a nice shade. Sometimes, if it's a really bright day, I will leave a section of this completely white for the sky and come in with my blue mixture immediately over top of the white. So that way there's no chance of muddying up the color. Then over here to this corner I'm finishing up, you'll notice there's actually a mountain that's sitting back there with two colors showing. A blue, and then the part that's closer to us is actually taking on a sort of orange color. And so I'm going to try to differentiate those as the painting moves forward. So now clearly you can see I haven't touched the lake yet, and there's a reason for that. We got the sky, we got most of the foliage in the background, we've got our tonal values, we've got some suggestions of the bank, some I'm working on right here. When we do the lake, we want to make sure that they're pretty much straight strokes down. And I wanted to put the foliage in first so that way I can vary the color of the shadows that are coming into the lake from the trees and the foliage around it. And you can see I'm pulling down the brush strokes. I don't want as many crisscross strokes, or this is not the time when you're painting water to put a lot of energy into it. You want to give the appearance that we got stagnant water here with the reflection of shadows and then some movement of water on the very top of the surface. In this case, there's hardly any movement on the top of the surface of this lake. And now you see that my interpretation is going to be that the lake reflections are a little bit lighter than the colors on the land. And that's usually the case. The objects that are vertical are going to be your darkest colors. So traditionally, your objects like trees and buildings and people are going to be darker than the land mass, the grasses, and then the sky. So the sky is usually the lightest, the ground plane, and then the verticals. And finally, the water tends to do different things. So it's not universal that you can always say that water is, the third darkest or the second darkest on a painting. Sometimes it can be the second lightest. Sometimes it can be darker than some of the things around it. So just be aware of that. So there's no real standard as far as the darkness of water, because it's always just a mirror. It's just reflecting the colors around it. So, and that can change by virtue of how the light is bouncing off of your other objects. So if you're dealing with water, my recommendation would be to leave it to the very last in terms of your underpainting and even in the subsequent layers before you commit to it. After you get everything else there, it will become more apparent what is needed. Well, I hope this is helping, having the reference painting right on top of the painting. I also wanted to allow you to see enough of my overall movement. So and if you're watching on a big enough screen, I think you'll be able to pick up enough of the details. Oh, what's the ribbon hanging on the wall? Yes, nicely placed advertisement for myself. Here in Washington, Missouri, we do have a plein air event that's located in Augusta, Missouri. You may have heard of the Augusta Plein Air Festival, and that takes place every year. It is always in April. And I was able to finally get a ribbon after a few years of trying. That is a judge's award for a theme painting that they had in 2023. The best way to learn painting and to become better is simply to paint. And of course, there's no substitute like painting outdoors. However, as I mentioned, there are certainly, I believe you can learn a lot from also painting in the studio. Many of us are not in a position in which we can freely take tons and tons of time every day to paint outside. If you've got a full-time job, kids to run the ball games, other events and activities in your life. I wonder if that's why so many of the painters I run into are retired painters. Here I'm cleaning off my tools. The whole canvas has now been filled in, and hopefully you can see a resemblance now to the big shapes that you see on my canvas panel and the reference photo. And if you squint, you can see the different tonal values that I have established. And of course, I can always tweak those. This next layer is the most important, which is, in my process, the color, laying in the color. And on top of that will be just a few highlights. So now we really want to spend some time on the palette, mixing our colors and trying to get it somewhat accurate. Now, I'm not, like I mentioned, I'm not a realist painter, so I'm not attempting to get an exact match with every stroke that I put down. But I do want to give an impression of how this scene feels and colors that are close to what we see in the reference photo. Sometimes that's impossible to do with a limited palette. In other words, we can get very close, but not perhaps as precise as if I had some additional colors on the palette. But after all, we're not really trying to, we already have a photo. So this is different. We're trying to express our feeling of being in this place. How did it feel? What was the energy level? What is the scene trying to convey in terms of emotional import to us, rather than trying to just have people look at our painting and say, wow, he really nailed what that looked like. And obviously, you're not going to have the reference photo right next to your painting in the gallery. And most people will never see the reference, will never realize what you were actually painting. Now, in some geographical areas, there's always going to be those spots that, if you're going to paint the White House, it better look like the White House. If you're going to paint something that's really famous and identifiable, it's usually a good idea to have it look something like the actual building or the actual location. Otherwise, it may be too jarring to the audience. Now, I often don't mind if I embellish or see embellished work. In fact, I kind of think that's what art is all about, is embellishing, taking the basics that nature provides and attempting to filter that through our personalities and our experiences of being in that location and experiencing the scene. Here, you'll notice it's a little hard. Sometimes this is also the problem with photo references. I'm actually putting a green shade over top of the burnt umber, but you would be hard pressed perhaps on many displays to see that difference. As you notice me putting strokes down, you can kind of see that the brown tone is disappearing somewhat. So maybe that will help you to see what I'm building up on top of it. And checking on those tonal values. I'm also trying to work very quickly. I find that if I spend too much time deciding on the mixture of colors or laying down a stroke, the more artificial it looks to me. And the less spontaneous, the less impressionistic, which is what I'm trying to attempt to do, is to just give you an impression. And so in various areas, I don't want a lot of detail. I don't want detail over here where I'm painting right now in that big mass. I want to pull you into the center of the painting, into that O composition, so that you're kind of going in a circle around and around in the middle of the painting and staying on my painting, not looking off to either side to the other paintings that are on the wall next to it. And you'll notice that my detail is set up already in that central area, especially if the tree trunks that are already drawn in there. I'll have to probably redraw them again and reestablish some darks, but I already have that as being the place where it's going to be the highest contrast with colors and detail, so that your eye is going to want to go in there and stay and look at those nuances rather than hovering around the edges. There's not that much that's interesting in those places of the painting. Now you still need some tonal values and some different strokes and such, of course, but that's really secondary to the focal point. And you'll notice the time. We're 32 minutes in. We've already done the underpainting. We're now putting in color. And I'm intentionally working this fast because when you do paint outdoors, you only have a few hours to really rely on the light. It's always changing and providing different effects. So most of my paintings this size, 11 by 14, take about 2 hours. Even though at a lot of the events, they'll give you 3 or 4 hours. And you'll notice that the pros all work very, very fast. They're constantly painting. They're constantly getting out there every single day and learning how to do that. And at this point, I might remind you that, yes, there are wonderful people that you can learn from who are professional painters and paint a lot more than I do. One of the things I can say is that when I started out, I found it somewhat discouraging to watch some of those demos from the professional artists because they were so advanced in comparison to what I was capable of doing. I felt defeated before I even started. So some of the folks that you notice on YouTube that may not have all kinds of awards, may not be very known, can still help improve your art. Because you are likely, if you're watching these videos, closer to their skill level and their ability. And hopefully that will provide you with some motivation, help you to understand a little bit more the nuances that the pros are using, because we that are in that intermediate category are also lifelong learners. And so we are practicing it and we're trying to maybe put it into a way that's a little bit more understandable because we're closer to your level and closer to understanding and trying to articulate it for ourselves what the pro painters are doing. Not pro paint, pro painters. Just want to clarify, Don't want anything exploding. And here you see a little bit more of the green coming in. A little bit lighter tonal value over here in this area, this big shape. And I'm making sure that there's not a lot of detail. I just wanted to pull us in to where there is detail. And I also want a little bit of that underpainting to show through. I guess I could have mentioned this is a fall scene. And so, therefore, you got a lot of these browns and red tones. And it takes some time to get the different areas painted up against each other before you really know whether your values and your colors are working. Sometimes maybe that could be described as a puzzle. You know, you have a piece of a puzzle and you're looking for where it might fit. And it's hard. It's harder to do a puzzle that's less complete, right? If you just have the border of the puzzle, that's how most people start, right? You find the pieces that have the flat edge, and then you start working inward. And the more you work and the fewer pieces that are empty, it's easier then to see what matches up. The same process happens with paintings. The more color that you get on the canvas, the easier it becomes to see where there is a problem or where the mixture is not working. How does it look next to the additional colors? And until you have those colors on the canvas to compare, it's very difficult to know if you're hitting the mark or not. So once again, give permission to make mistakes. You can always go back over top of it, even if you have to wait a day and let it dry some, if you're worried about that, or if you've gotten the paint too thick at this point. For example, there's a little bit of a rise, a little bit of a hill where there's obviously some different type of vegetation that's more orange in nature. Right now, you notice that there's this big kind of red mass in the middle of the painting. Well, once again, I'm not getting too frustrated with it. It's not the color I want yet. It'll serve well, though, because it is in the red family, when I put the orange over top of it. And that may even add to the enjoyment of the painting because it's not a flat color. It's going to have some nuances of color because you've got some oranges and you've got some of those reds shining through to the final painting. What tripod am I using? I'm using the Slick U8000, which is recommended by the folks that make the Coulter easel. And that Coulter easel basically just provides a table that folds up into a box where I can store my paints for additional painting sessions for the next day. It gives me a nice work area, much larger than a Pochade box. And because I'm a tall painter, I'm 6'1", I found that most Pochade boxes simply don't work for me because I have to have that painting up high enough for my eyes. And the Pochade box means that I'm then kind of in a T-Rex pose as I'm trying to paint. My hands are way up high and they get fatigued in that position. And all that weight is on top of the small tripod in that box, the Pochade box, and it tends to be harder to keep the Pochade box panels from moving on you and having problems with balance or the wind blowing or knocking something over. So I have found that the Coulter easel is just a wonderful design in that respect. I've had really good success. If you do paint in windy conditions, one thing you can do is with the bag of trash there that I have hanging on the tripod, you could put a large rock from the area that you're painting in that, just to give it some more weight to keep it from toppling over. The U8000 Slick tripod also has a very wide stance in comparison to a lot of the carbon fiber tripods. The U8000 is an aluminum model, so a couple advantages is that it's got this wide spread to keep it from falling over. It also is much cheaper to purchase. You can get these off of Amazon for 40, 50 bucks at most. And then, of course, this whole setup is made of wood, so it's quite light. I think the box and the panel carrier together weigh about 5 pounds. And compare that to an empty, get this, an empty French easel, which usually weighs about 14 to 16 pounds. And then, for a French easel, just imagine then adding the weight of all your paints, all your brushes, all your equipment. I have a very cheap backpack that I'm able to fit everything in but the tripod and the canvas panel holder. I use a Raymar canvas panel holder. Another way to cut costs is to restrict yourself to painting in one size when you're going outside predominantly. So I stick usually to an 11 by 14. And then I've got the Raymar carrier that fits the 11 by 14. And so that's what I take with me when I want to paint is an 11 by 14 panel, my 11 by 14 canvas panel carrier, and then this easel. Now, of course, I can change it up. This setup will actually, I can put a 16 by 20 panel using this one. This model is the compact. They make 3 sizes. One's the mini, the other is the compact, which is the middle size that I'm using here. And then there's the standard size or large size. And then the canvas panel holder, there's 3 different sizes for that as well. So I essentially got the medium box, but I got the largest panel carrier they make. They do sell them in sets, and so the sets don't give you the choice. It's just, the compact model comes with the compact panel holder. The mini comes with the mini panel holder, which limits the size a little bit more of the panel that you can paint. Now here, you should be able to see that this green is fairly similar to the reference photo. Obviously, to get that color mixture of these various greens, I'm only using 3 colors. I'm using the primary yellow, I'm using ultramarine blue, and then I'm using a little bit of alizarin crimson to kick back the color some, and that's it. So it is all a matter of the ratios of the colors that I'm mixing in terms of the color variations. And oftentimes, if you squint, you'll see that the tonal value of most of these things is actually the same. Not a lot of difference. The difference is the hue, the color that we're putting down. Now here, I've decided, I've got some yellow available on my palette, I'm going to put some highlights where I see some of the sunlight bouncing off of the ground plane. Especially right there in the center of the painting again, right? Which is where the details need to go, so that way they draw your attention to it. Which is also making the red stand out more, which is helping me to figure out, yes, I've got to eventually go back in with an orange and cover that up and look at where else in the painting I could put some orange. The other mistake that sometimes I made when I was younger was I would see one color in the landscape and I'd put it only in one place. Well, it does help you to see what the focal point might be. But usually in nature, you don't see that one color in just one place. Maybe on a building or a sign or something, but in nature itself, there are little echoes of that same color someplace else in the landscape. And you want to put some of those little highlights in because it helps to create a sense of unity in your painting. So when I go to applying some orange in here, I'm going to look at all the places that could use a little touch of that orange while I have it on my brush. Here I'm just showing you a few of the colors I'm using as I'm mixing on the palette. You'll also notice at this mark that I'm slowing up. I'm not painting quite as fast because I want to get these colors right. And you can do that by making sure that the colors look okay on the palette. I'm even touching some of the paint drops onto the reference photo, which is just a standard piece of paper that came out of my copy machine, to see if I'm on target with some of these color mixtures. And here I'm going back over some of the gray areas of the burnt umber with this new shade of green, which is a little bit lighter tonal value. As you can tell, if you squint, you can see that it's not the same as the darker trees, and that's why it's popping out at you. And it may also help to realize that as I'm painting these trees and this foliage here, I'm not thinking about painting trees and foliage. I'm thinking about painting the abstract shapes that I see. And then covering the canvas where I see the white still coming through, I'm covering that up. And I'm also applying a little bit thicker paint now, obviously to go over top of the underpainting, and then to give it a little bit more character now. So first pass underpainting, it's going to be very light. Remember your thin, lean to thick approach. So the last layers of paint that you put on should have the most oil in them, or in this case, the most pigment, because I'm not adding anything to the paint. It's just coming right out of the tube. The underpainting, I put water in. But this second coat that I've been doing now, I barely put any water into it. I'm almost just using the straight paint. So right now at the second layer, it doesn't feel at all like I'm not using traditional oils. It's like using traditional oils. I don't really notice a whole lot of difference here, other than when I mentioned to you that I do find I'm using a little bit more of the paint to create the same effect, but that's the only big difference I've noticed. There are some other professional artists that you could turn to that are using water mixable oils that you could check out. Charlie Hunter, who uses basically a palette for plein air that consists of two colors. Then you have Lori McNee. She uses a much more extensive palette of colors. So those are a couple of options of folks that are using water mixable oils at this moment who are doing fantastic work. And if you check out some of their information and demos, it might also help you if you decide that water mixable oils are something that you would rather paint with than traditional oils, which have oftentimes still a lot of fumes. Even with the odorless mineral spirits, people do still develop sensitivities to that. Or folks that are a little bit worried about exposure to cadmium metals and such. There are fewer of those types of colors available in the Cobra line. And partly due, I guess, to that. They know who their audience is, and their audience are folks that care about the environment, care about health, and are looking for alternatives to some of those heavy metals and harmful chemicals. Here I'm mixing the orange that I had mentioned. And as you see me disappear from the screen, I'm often stepping back quite a ways so that I can see what the painting looks like from a distance, because it's supposed to be an impression. So it's not the detail that's really going to catch your attention. I'm looking for the overall composition, colors. Even here, I'm noticing that it's still very red, too bright. And so I'm going to continue to rework this in the latter half of this painting, which we're almost to the hour mark. I think that I painted for about an hour and a half. So we still have quite a ways to go yet. We haven't even touched the sky yet. At this point, I'm noticing I'm going to intentionally make this a little bit darker than you see in the reference photo. Partly because I want this section to really be a strong highlight for me, setting the viewer right into the painting like that. There are times in which you want to clean off the palette. I'm getting some paper towels now and cleaning off the brushes, and then since most of the dark shades are on the panel, I'm cleaning it off and getting ready at this point to tackle some of the lighter lights of the sky. And so I'm taking a moment to make sure I don't contaminate my colors. And of course, blue being a very light color can easily be contaminated by the greens and the oranges that I've just mixed. If you're interested in buying any of my artwork, go to my YouTube channel, and in the comment sections of the page, I will give you the website where you can go. I often sell on eBay, but I also have my own, I'm working on my own website right now. I've had a little bit of trouble with providers, and so I'm in the midst of switching. So if you have trouble finding me, do a search for David Poe or David W. Poe or David Wesley Poe. There are, of course, other artists in other fields that have the same name as I do, and have some of their own websites. So that's a little frustrating to find something that really works. Now here, I already know, that's much too dark. But I'm committed. So I'm gonna get the shape of this mountain in first, and then I will work on softening it. And notice right away how that draws your attention right off the corner of the painting like that. And like I mentioned, you don't know that, though, until you put it on the panel. But oils, water mixable or traditional, are very forgiving. You can take a paper towel, wipe it off. You can let it dry for a while and then come back over top of it and paint a different layer. So don't get discouraged. There are lots and lots of ways to correct a painting. Now here, you notice I've lightened the mixture. I like that much better. A little bit darker than what the photo reference is, but it's not terrible. And I will come back in and lighten this up a little bit more towards the end of the video. Now I'm attempting to soften that ridge. Now I'm doing the same thing throughout the sky, putting more titanium white and basically just mixing right on the canvas panel. And I'm proving the concept here that you really can't tell until you get the paint on the canvas. And so you got to be open to do some change. And as you can see, the paints can work quite well in achieving that effect. Once again, if you have a comment or question, you can always leave it. And I usually will respond within 24 hours if you're leaving a message. If you like the channel, give a thumbs up. Share it with friends and family members or other folks that might enjoy them. Subscribe to the channel. I would greatly appreciate it. Also, let me know if you like the length of these videos. I know that other artists like to produce rather short videos or painting videos that are high speed. But I've noticed that a lot of folks seem to like this channel and the videos I posted previously because they are slower, and I'm not speeding them up. I'm showing you in real time each of the strokes that I'm making, or at least for most of my videos. And then with a talking commentary, I did publish a few that don't have any commentary. That's just me and showing you my painting process without any commentary. But I noticed those were not as well liked. So let me know if you have a preference. Is that still correct? Or are there those of you out there that would like to see shorter content, quicker content, or something of this nature on the channel? Now that we've reached the 1 hour mark, you're going to see me really concentrating on some highlights now. Showing you that that's a round brush. It's a number 2 round. I'm going to go and the tops of the trees. How do we do that? You're seeing just a few leaves. You're seeing a lot of sky. Well, the best way I know how to do this and the quickest way is to take a brush and cleaning it and leaving a little bit of water on there, just a little bit. I'm not adding any color, but notice what I'm doing. I'm now pulling the two colors together, a little bit of the sky and a little bit of the green on the very tops of the trees, to indicate areas where that sky is kind of peeping through and where the trees are a little thinner at the very top. I'm also making sure that I'm not leaving the same mark over and over again at the top of the trees. I'm trying to vary it. The mind likes patterns, but our paintings don't. We want our paintings to have a sort of creativity and originality to them that defy patterns. But the brain constantly wants us to make the same stroke, to copy what we've already done. So you have to be conscious of that. Some artists will take a mirror and flip the image. By looking at the painting in the mirror, you can tell if there are patterns that you didn't see before. Because after you stare at a canvas for so long and you've worked on it, it becomes harder and harder for you to see patterns of behavior or strokes that have been made in the same fashion over and over and over again. Once again, not thrilled about that reddish orange yet. Giving it another go. Of course, that requires thicker paint on top. Otherwise, it'll just mix with the layer below and dilute the color that I'm trying to make. And here I'm much more happy with that. Add a little bit more of a yellowy orange. And I'm finding that somewhat satisfying. Even if it may be a little darker than what the reference photo shows. And now I'm putting some more of the oranges. Remember what I said, one orange area will kind of stick out like a sore thumb, but if you got some echoes in the entire composition, then it looks much more natural that you would find that particular color there, right? Even as it draws our attention into the center of the painting. And see, so that big mass there that I just painted some orange into, it's not full of detail. It's designed simply to pull you into the main area of the painting. I don't want you staying over there on the edge of the painting. I want you to come in to where the darkest dark and that lightest light of the road and the darkest dark of those trees is meeting. And then lining up to make us then consider, oh, there's some trees there that we see. oh, we see the reflection of the trees in that little lake there. And hopefully that captures our imagination and our eye to want to keep going around and around in the composition in those areas where there's the highest detail. How did I learn to paint? I'm self-taught. Just a lot of practice, a lot of watching YouTube videos like you're doing right now. I didn't want to spend a bunch of money on a hobby, not knowing whether I would really get into it or not. After I went that route, though, I did purchase a couple of pro videos. And that did help me. If nothing else, it taught me that every artist has a different way of doing their process. And there's no one right way. And eventually, after you emulate several of the artists that you like the most, you begin to start finding your style. You might like painting your buildings like McPherson. You may enjoy certain techniques that you picked up from, let's say, a Laurie McNeil or a Charlie Hunter or someone like that, or Schmid. And you hold on to those, as well as adding to it your own spin. Eventually, you get to the point where you're no longer really just copying the works of, or at least the strokes and the technical aspects of the particular painter you admire, but you begin to pick up on what you like to do. How do you like to combine some of the things that you learned? And it's always good practice to take some of the painters that you like and enjoy the most, looking at their paintings and doing a copy of them. Just don't, just make sure that you're signing or making some acknowledgement that it is a copy of somebody else's original design and work, that it's not original for you. You can do that on the back. You can maybe leave it unsigned if you're going to do something like that. Many artists just never show those paintings. It's just for practice. Now here I've made a decision, and hopefully that's not creating too much of a distraction there in the corner with those shades of orange and blue. So I leave it alone, or I try to lighten it just a tad more. You can see clearly now that the gray road is leading us right into the center of the painting, into the darkest dark, meeting the lightest light of that road. And now I'm gonna begin to shift a few gears here, put a few more marks on this shoreline, and then I'm going to be turning some attention to detail of more tree trunks, both into the lake and on the shoreline, to draw our focus even more into this area of the painting. I titled this particular painting "In the Early Hours." So it reminds me of the light first coming up. It's still a little misty or cloudy, and so it's the light's not that strong, but it is still having its effect on the landscape to some extent. Washing out my brush with just plain old water. And now I'm going to use the palette knife to put some highlights on. Especially, I really like doing this technique that I don't know if someone else showed me or I just started doing it, but putting some tree trunks in with the palette knife. I'm creating a dark green here. By the way, don't use ivory black anymore. You can make a really dark from ultramarine blue and your alizarin crimson, or with ultramarine blue and just a little touch of permanent yellow or primary yellow. This particular mixture is a very dark green. And so I'm just using the edge of the palette knife to suggest the trunks. And then I'm going to pull some of those into the lake as reflections here soon as well. Starting with the vertical lines, but I'll also put some horizontal tree trunks in there too. I don't want the viewer thinking that these are just a bunch of toothpicks lining the shore. And after I do that, I'm going to come back in and put a few more greens on top to suggest the foliage obviously is going to be on both sides of the tree. There are going to be parts of the tree trunks and the branches that you don't see. And so you can't just leave a bunch of dark lines on the top of these greens. You've got to put some of the greens on top of the dark lines for the right effect, more realistic effect. See how those lines are starting to draw you into that space even more? So it's not just the darks and the lights hitting each other, but also some of this detail now that we're putting in, which isn't all that much detail. But you don't need much. It's just a few strokes here, a few strokes there, and it's amazing what the human brain fills in. It wants detail. It wants to see these abstract shapes as something. So on the canvas, it may just look like a dash of different greens, but to the human eye, it takes it and it translates it into, oh, that must be a forest. Yeah, that's what it is. It's a forest of trees, and those lines, yeah, those aren't lines. Those are trunks. Those are branches. That's reflected light from the sky on the lake, and all those choices being made by our brains is very helpful to this whole creative process. We're hopeful that the viewer is able to tap into that resource because it provides that illusion of detail and imagination that we're looking for to interpret this as a creative work. Here I'm using that palette knife to lay a few darker darks around the lake to help suggest better to the viewer that these are the boundaries of that water body on both sides of the lake. And I'm also adding that darker green to just a few places here in the foreground where I see it in the reference photo and wherever else it may be needed. You certainly don't want areas of a painting where it's just like a flat color. If it's all one variation of green in that front portion of the painting, it makes for a very boring painting. Or at least the question, why did you include such a boring spot of land in the painting? So here, I'm seizing off of a few of the darks I see in the foreground, suggesting places that are a little deeper and getting less sunlight reflected, and breaking up some of the big mass of green that's in that section, so that your brain begins to say, yeah, that's more like a hill. Yeah, that's more like some nuances in the grass, like a field that I've seen before. Are there subject matters you would like to see me paint in future episodes? Drop those ideas down below. It's getting very warm in the studio, so I have the air conditioning off so you can hear me better, but I turned a fan on, so if you hear some background information, noise, I'm sorry, but that's from the fan, and it's crucial for me to have that on right now. Painting this in August of 23, so pretty warm climate right here in Missouri. Of course, it's always difficult to figure out, where do you stop? Am I making the painting better? Or am I just changing the painting at this stage? So you notice I'm going to be more careful. I'm stepping away to try to evaluate it, see if I agree with it or not, and whether it's about time for me to sign the painting. Here, I'm adding a little bit of a line on the road that I see. I think it's just shadows I'm not sure that it's not like a railing or anything like that, or a guard or anything. But I do think that touch of dark color there really pops and points the viewer into the painting even more from the road coming from that side. Of course, it's all subjective, right? One of the things that really excites me, just my creative interest, is producing a painting that's fairly chaotic in terms of brushstrokes, and yet being able to step away and see it representing the real thing. As I continue to work as an impressionistic artist, and I'm noticing that more and more of my paintings are looking more realistic, even though I'm not thinking about making them realistic. Does that make sense? I'm just thinking about the big shapes, making the color variations where I see them, trying to work as fast as I can without overthinking things, and stepping away ever so often to see how that is looking for the viewer. And there's something kind of magical and wonderful about that, isn't there? It's also a reason why I like landscape painting. There's more of the abstract shapes. Obviously, when you're dealing with buildings, at some level, you've got to be good at your designs. You have to be able to convince people that the perspective is right on your building walls, right? And the colors need to be fairly accurate, a little bit more so, I think, than in landscape paintings. Primarily because people expect it to look like the building that they can look at. But landscapes, there's so many ways, so many subjects, so many different angles or views that you can take on the subject, and trying to find your own artistic voice in the midst of all the others that have gone before you and all that will come after you. It's a tremendous amount of work, and it's also a tremendous joy when you take a few days off and come back and say, yeah, this painting really did work. And also don't get discouraged, because sometimes you think that you're going to paint a masterpiece every time you go out. I've heard estimates from the pros that even the pros, 1 out of 10 paintings is really gallery sellable. And oftentimes it's a smaller percentage than that. And of course, for us amateurs and intermediates, you can multiply that by about 3. Every 30 paintings, maybe you'll have one that's really qualified to be in a gallery and to sell. But over time, the chances of really painting that exceptional painting that will sell off the easel increases. Something that you might want to consider is that if you're just doing this for practice, is that everybody can sell their painting. I started selling almost right away, and they weren't particularly great paintings, but it helped me to understand the business practice, helped me to realize how you glaze a painting, or how you protect it and varnish it, how you sell it and how you ship it, all of those things. And it was much easier to practice with works that were less than stellar. So that way, if a painting got ruined because I didn't ship it adequately or didn't know how to varnish it, it wasn't a big loss. So always remember that even those works that are not as your masterpieces, they still can have a very important purpose in your learning. They also make great gifts to your friends, family members, co-workers, anybody that'll take them. And now I'm going to sign this painting. I just use a little rubber tool, and so that's what's going on. Thank you so much for watching this video today, and I will certainly see you in the next one. I'll show you a close-up here in just a second of this painting. And I'll be producing more as the time goes by. So here's a close-up of it. There's the reference. Off the internet, free site, rights included, and then here's my interpretation of that reference.